Hello and welcome to the Northwood Podcast. I'm your host, Heath Jones. I pastor Northwood Christian Church in Indianapolis, Indiana, hence the name of the podcast, the Northwood Podcast. I record these episodes nearly weekly, about every week, sometimes skipping one or two, in my church, which is why you may now be subjected to background noise, although things are a little quieter right now. But moments ago, children were shouting and screaming in the playground. So if you hear background noise, apologies in advance. This podcast is produced and distributed by the All Indiana Podcast Network. If you want to learn more about the All Indiana Podcast Network, I encourage you to check them out. You can find all of their offerings at www.wishtv.com/podcasts. That's wishtv.com/podcasts. And there you will be able to find a wide array of podcasts spanning many topics and made by others who call Indiana home. But if you aren't from Indiana, don't let this deter you, as I believe there's something there for nearly everyone. Now, I'll not belabor this next point, but if you're interested, my church's website is www.indncc.org. That's indncc.org. So if you'd like to learn more about our church or service times or what have you, that is where you should go. Now, here in a moment, we'll be going over a passage from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3. But first, we need to pause for our podcast audience. And so if this means you, we'll catch you after the break. And we're back. And the passage that we'll be considering today is found in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verses 20 through 35. And I'll just read it. Then he went home, and the crowd came together again, so that they could not even eat. When his family heard it, they went out to restrain him, for people were saying, "He has gone out of his mind." And the scribes who came down from Jerusalem said, "He has Beelzebul, and by the ruler of the demons he casts out demons." And he called them to him and spoke to them in parables. How can Satan cast out Satan? If a kingdom is divided against itself, that kingdom cannot stand. And if a house is divided against itself, that house will not be able to stand. And if Satan has risen up against himself and is divided, he cannot stand, but his end has come. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man. Then indeed the house can be plundered. Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin. For they had said, "He has an unclean spirit." Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said to him, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside, asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." And we'll just leave it there. In the next chapter, Jesus will go on to tell several parables. He's not done talking yet, but that's enough for us to consider today. And this passage, I'll tell you up front, is about two topics that are interconnected. One, who has the power? And two, where does our final allegiance lie? And these two questions are brought to the surface by Jesus' interactions with two separate groups in this story. And the question for us today is, where does our power come from? And in whom does our loyalty lie? Today's story begins with an interaction between a family and a wayward son. Jesus, being the wayward son, has been traveling the countryside and has garnered quite a lot of attention for himself. He's been so successful in his mission to heal that he's been casting out demons and proclaiming God's realm. And hordes of people have followed Jesus now wherever he goes. He's got a whole thrall of people and train behind him. And in this passage, Jesus has gone home to find that the crowds even follow him there. Maybe he was going for respite. Nothing doing. Crowd follows him there. And the text reads that, quoting, the crowds came together again so that they could not even eat. That's from verse 20. And we are left with an image here of Jesus and the disciples trying to have a meal, a simple meal, but the crowds are so oppressive that they can't even eat their food. Jesus' family, they had caught wind of things, the things that their child, son, cousin, brother had been doing. And they entered into this scene actually to not ask for wisdom or guidance or healing, but to stage an intervention. It says that they were out to restrain him. And these words are translated from the same words used to describe how soldiers would later seize Jesus when he was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane. Forceful restraint. But why use such force? Well, you'd have to know the times and the customs to understand why a family might react this way upon Jesus' return. Because Jesus was raised in a time and in a place in which persons and families were in competition for finite amounts of honor. Now, this may sound odd, I know, but in Jesus' day, it was thought that within each community there was a finite amount of honor to bestow. You gained some honor from the get-go by virtue of your birth. And if you were born into a family of high honor, then you were off to a good start. But thereafter, one would obtain honor by public acts of service, hospitality, and deeds that earned a family or home some respect. So to use a metaphor, imagine that honor and status in a community could be measured in liquid form. And there's not an infinite amount of this, but a finite amount. And the community has an understanding of this and knows that honor and status are being distributed as people are hosting parties and giving gifts or falling into disgrace. But it's limited, the amount of honor. So someone is elevated. When that happens in status or prestige, it comes at the cost of someone else's status or prestige. We'll call it clout. So if you really want to have some lowlife in the family who might besmirch the family name, well, Jesus is not the kind of guy that you want these days because he is raising a ruckus and it's embarrassing. And, Jesus' family not having all the clout in the world to give away, probably all indications point towards a simple family from humble origins. And in this story, Jesus' family is afraid that he is going to throw away whatever honor they have by Jesus' rowdy behavior. So here they are restraining Jesus. That's why they're wanting to shut him up. It's as if they wish to sweep him under the rug to safeguard the family reputation. The point, your family and loved ones aren't always going to understand or approve, even if you are doing it right. And here we are in a Christian church. So I'm guessing that we can all agree up front that Jesus was doing the right things as he championed God's realm, but his family was afraid and wished that he would stop. I mean, they'd have to be really afraid if they were willing to seize Jesus in public to make him stop, because that would be a spectacle right there. How would you respond in that situation if you were Jesus or the family? Well, have you ever been in a place left trying to explain to the people who you love most, let's just say you're the Jesus in the situation, and trying to explain to the people you love most in the world why you must persist in action or behavior that they feel is wrong-headed? And then enter the scribes, the religious teachers and professionals, and they fit very well within the views of the family, who are a bit anxious about Jesus' actions in terms of his reputation. However, they are also upset for a different reason. They see Jesus as a threat to their power. The power they have as the intercessors between God and the people. And Jesus provides far too easy access. You don't have to, jump through hoops with Jesus or practice the prescribed rituals. And Jesus claims to have the Holy Spirit by which he heals, casts out demons, and forgives sins. And these were all deeds that fell under the purview of the priestly class. However, they couldn't deny the results. And the community had seen the results, the things that Jesus was able to do. And theoretically, he shouldn't be able to do those things if he's not on the right side. So they accused Jesus of being possessed by the devil. This is a classic answer given when religious folk are uneasy. Blame the devil. Demonize what may not be. What may not be a risk, a threat, may even be wholesome. I've met people who accuse others of being in league with the devil whenever whatever they witness falls outside of their sensibilities. And we all have some idea, if only in our heads, of how God is supposed to work. And religious institutions like to enshrine their ideas and traditions, holding them up as the exclusive and best way to know God. And the scribes in this story knew that Jesus was a threat to their authority. Then and now, they're cut from the same cloth as so many today in our churches and institutions. For Jesus was able to produce the results that they had often promised. So they accused Jesus instead of working in league with the devil, not their God. And Jesus' answer is very sensible. He points out what should be very obvious. How can Satan cast out Satan, is the way he puts it. Jesus uses the power and authority he has to bring healing and wholeness. And this is so different from the works of a devil who might use their power and influence to bring hurt and brokenness. So in answer to his accusers, Jesus points towards the fruit of his labors as evidence. He even claims to have the power to bind the forces of darkness. That's what he meant by that quote in verse 27. But no one can enter a strong man's house and plunder his property without first tying up the strong man, and indeed the house can be plundered. In other words, translation, Jesus has the power to subdue evil and plunder the home built on evil ways. This power was given him by God's Spirit. Jesus then goes on to say a few astounding things about God's Holy Spirit. Starting with verse 28, quoting, "Truly I tell you, people will be forgiven for their sins and whatever blasphemies they utter. But whoever blasphemes against the Holy Spirit can never have forgiveness, but is guilty of an eternal sin." For they had said, they being those accusing Jesus here, he has an unclean spirit. Now, I like that first part, that part about anyone who utters blasphemies may be forgiven. You can be forgiven whatever sins or blasphemies you utter. In other words, there is nothing you can do or say to cut you off from God's grace. But then Jesus names one sin that is not forgiven, namely blasphemy of the Holy Spirit. And I must confess, this totally freaked me out as a kid. The unforgivable sin, as it was called, was spoken from time to time of what this might be. And my brother and I would speculate as to what it might be. And I thought maybe it was as simple as saying the words, "I blaspheme," insert Holy Spirit. So I can say that now, but I used to not even be able to say that, even when I didn't believe that's what it was. That's how much of a grip this taboo had on me. So most of the time, we thought that while we didn't know what it was, it must be really bad. After all, it was so bad that you couldn't be forgiven. So I used to worry if I'd blaspheme the Holy Spirit by accident. How would you even know? So I guess my question here, what gives? What does Jesus mean? Well, it turns out that the answer is within this text itself. Consider the context. We've been talking about Jesus doing good and wonderful things through God's Holy Spirit, the source of light and love. That's where that's the wellspring from which this flows. And the scribes accuse Jesus of being possessed by the devil and doing Satan's work. It is after Jesus points out the absurdity of this claim that he names blasphemy of the Holy Spirit as the unforgivable sin. And the text goes on to say, "For they had said he has an unclean spirit." Apparently, to claim that the work of God's Holy Spirit is, in fact, the work of an unclean spirit is the great sin. That is the sin. Jesus is describing those whose hearts and minds are so turned against God's life-giving works that they call evil good and good evil. Those who do this are so bent towards evil, they may not recover. Porter Case Taylor writes on the website Pathos, quoting, "Jesus makes it clear that the unforgivable sin is recognizing the work of the Holy Spirit and attributing it to demons and Satan. It is to stand oneself against forgiveness habitually." That last line, too, end quote, by the way. That last line I'll also note or emphasize that this is not something that you do once. The word habitually provides us a key. Those who blaspheme in this sense do so as a way of life. It's not something you do once and you can never recover. It's a way you are, pushing against forces for peace, inclusion, and justice, and in preference for this world of violence, hatred, and greed. Divided houses, divided nations. But enough of that. After Jesus has been challenged and even seized by his family, and after he has been rebuked by the religious authorities, Jesus continues to teach. His family find themselves on the outside of the house in which he is teaching. And this is telling. This reveals a distinction between old familial ties and the bond he now shares with his disciples. The text puts it this way, starting with verse 31. Then his mother and his brothers came, and standing outside, they sent to him and called him. A crowd was sitting around him, and they said, "Your mother and your brothers and sisters are outside asking for you." And he replied, "Who are my mother and my brothers?" And looking at those who sat around him, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. Whoever does the will of God is my brother and sister and mother." End quote. Jesus' answer points towards a deeper loyalty in God. Jesus is closer in this moment to his disciples because they see it the same. They are working together to do God's will. They've caught a glimpse of the same vision. And in this work, they discover an intimacy that transcends even familial ties. Notice the familial ties are not severed. That's something people may take away from this sometimes, and unnecessarily so. As a matter of fact, we know that Jesus' family would grow closer together as the story would proceed. The family ties would deepen. His mother remained with him to the end, and his brother James became an apostle. But one can envision times when faithfulness to God might strain the bonds of our important relationships. I mean, come on, it's a tale as old as time. Let's say, for the sake of a hypothetical, that we try and cast out the demon of perpetual war. Conversations around the dinner table, you know how they may go if you talk about such a thing. I can remember that show, The Wonder Years. Love the show. They took a crack at it in one episode. The older hippie sister and her beatnik boyfriend tried to explain to the old man why they were against the war. A sentiment made more prescient as a neighborhood boy had just been killed overseas in said war. But then came Dad's response. "What do you mean you're against the war?" I don't remember the lines verbatim, but he exploded. And the family went on to respond, "What are you, unpatriotic? Don't you love and support the troops and, by insinuation, everything good and holy if you don't support that war?" And our institutions and corporations, they will respond in kind, for war is very profitable, and there are many who have their wealth tied up in the business of war. Things get so twisted that by the end of these conversations, it becomes clear that some people think war is good, or at least worth our time, or at best inevitable. Some even use God or their religion to justify it. Churches move to defend the indefensible, from civilian casualties by accident to collateral damage, heavy quote-unquote collateral damage, translate human lives dead, and those nearly on purpose, at least recklessly killed. Could it be that those who use God to justify unjustifiable suffering and violence blaspheme the Holy Spirit? But that was just one of the things Jesus did, advocate for peace. What else? Well, he healed. He valued the physical health of those to which he ministered, so he healed their physical bodies. Jesus, by way of miracle. Historically, churches, though, have met this obligation and need by way of hospitals and healing centers, where health care was provided to all, irregardless of ability to pay. It's almost as if a right to one's health stemmed from a Christian principle. Who would have thought? But those who commodify our health, putting a literal price on the years of our lives, call our attempts to cut out the profit motive from our healthcare systems, and we're met with pushback, with loud noises from those who have been made wealthy on the backs of the sick. You might bring these things up to your family, and they might respond, "Stop with the socialist drive. We shouldn't be expected to fit the bill for others, should have thought of how they'd pay to get healthy before they got sick," etc., etc. I don't know if you've ever been a part of these sorts of conversations. Prices the whole while go up. Church folk pray about a solution and try to keep up with expenses. Some even use theology to justify this, saying things like, God must be punishing them, or God helps those who help themselves. Could it be that those who use God to justify unjustifiable suffering and illness blaspheme the Holy Spirit? But that was just one of the things Jesus did, advocate for health. What else? What else? Well, care for the poor generally. We could broaden it. Or care for the environment, all of it. Care for, well, the list goes on and on. We're stewards of it all. And Jesus has called us to care for those things along with him. We are responsible for the world we've been given to live in. And we are called as Christians to do our best to make it better reflect Jesus' perspective. But so many fight forces striving for life by defending capitalism, militarism, neoliberalism, neoconservatism, all of the isms. And many use their faith to fight or frighten others away from fighting for the very things Jesus advocated for. Could it be that those who use God to justify unjustifiable suffering and death blaspheme the Holy Spirit? A great sin. There is a lot more we could talk about, but here's the point of this passage. Sometimes your family and even our religious leaders will be so captivated by our culture that they will try to set you straight when you're right. Jesus was seized by his family. You might get a talking to at Thanksgiving, or you might have your family avoid talking to you altogether, or your friends, or past ties, meaningful relationships. Or the authorities of our day, the would-be prophets and wise ones, will tell you that the gospel is impractical, that war is always inevitable or even preferred, that healing through healthcare is simply something we cannot afford, that systems that perpetuate poverty are as permanent as the laws of physics and should never be removed or cannot be, or that care for our planet is not something we should prioritize or do as best as we are able. These are all things, by the way, I think Jesus calls us to. And the good news is the same Holy Spirit that many blaspheme is alive in us. We have been given God's power through God's Spirit. We are a part of God's family. We answer to the highest power, and we've been enlivened by the highest power. When we are seized for preaching the message or accused by authorities, all is well. You are my sisters and my brothers, my mothers and my fathers. Together we will see God do amazing things around us and through us. Do not be ashamed or afraid. There is one more line I'd like to reflect on before we end our time together. It's the line you might have thought was ascribed to Abraham Lincoln. It's the famous House Divided speech, or comes from that, or you may have thought it came from that speech he gave at the 1858 Republican Convention. And no surprise to you at this point, quoting this passage, he made the point that when a house or family or tribe, in this case country, is divided in fundamental ways, it falls apart. It's a good thing. We got our act together these days, right? Except it's not really funny, because our house, our houses, our communities, our churches, our institutions, our political parties, well, it feels like everything in the year 2024, divided, falling apart. Falling apart. We're at least divided, maybe falling apart. But as I said, it was not Abe Lincoln who coined the phrase. He was quoting Jesus, and in the context in which Jesus said these things, by now it should be clear that sometimes when a house is divided, It's all you can do to stay the course toward what's good and true. If you are derided for defending migrants, if you are called a predator for defending queer people, if you are called uninformed for defending the environment, remember that Jesus told you it would be this way, sometimes taking flack even from our closest kin. It can break our hearts. You can know where to go to, who to turn. Jesus stayed fast to the course and continued to do what he came to do. And I'll remind us now that God saw him through every contingency, even through death. That far. God saw the disciples through too. And God will see us through in time. So here we are with this message of hope, the same one, the message of hope, love, and peace that Jesus preached. And it is radical, and it is a threat to religious and economic institutions and all other divided houses these days. But as I said, do not be ashamed or afraid. Preach the good news of God in every place and forward it on. If God is for us, who can stand against us? In a land of houses divided, ours is God's house, where everyone is welcome. A solid house, undivided, safe and secure, built on a sure foundation. Christ is the cornerstone, as they say, for the house Jesus builds is founded on love. And so is never this house divided. God's house. For you and everyone else are welcome here. So please, don't take your time and enter in.